Hey folks, Brandon Vigliarolo at the Register, and I'm here today with Scott Small, Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence at Tidal Cyber, to talk about the continually growing problem that is the Akira ransomware and the group behind it. Scott, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've seen you mention previously that you thought that Akira was poised to become one of the most dangerous ransomware threats, out there, beyond the threats posed by the groups of like BlackCat, right? So why is it? Why does the Akira pose such a risk?
Yeah, for sure. So we're seeing a lot of both intent and capability associated with the Akira ransomware operation, and those two things combined to make something a threat. So over the past year, this group actually, it may not be on a lot of folks' radars. It's growing in prominence and reporting around it, but it actually ranked sixth out of around 80 ransomware groups that we track in terms of victim tallies. Now, those are just claimed victims, but it is kind of a good estimation of a threat's intent to go after targets. And then I mentioned capability. We're seeing a lot of clear and consistent and strong tactics, techniques, and procedures associated with this operation. So it's attacking a lot of targets, and it has a lot of good capabilities to carry those out as well.
Right now, so I understand that whereas they've got some good capabilities, right? A lot of what they're doing and using to infiltrate people this is not new techniques, right? Like I understand it was just maybe a week or two ago that CISA published an advisory on Akira that mentioned, right, that they were using some 4-year-old vulnerabilities in Cisco hardware to gain access to systems, right? I mean, is this a matter of, sort of a bunch of cyber criminals with base level abilities, simply exploiting known issues, or is this actually a skilled group of people that are just going after soft targets?
Yeah, this is very much a skilled group. And certainly they are targeting those soft targets, but they're also going after bigger players as well. We're seeing kind of across the board targeting from this operation. Really, the breadth of capabilities that are at play here, this is a ransomware as a service. So various affiliate actors could be involved in attacking targets on behalf of the main Akira ransomware operation. The level and breadth of TTPs that these actors use is right up there on par with some of the most known and prominent ransomware groups, the LockBits and the BlackCats. What's interesting there is that we have actually seen somewhat successful disruption operations against those major players. And so Akira is truly kind of next in line to kind of step in and help fill in that void and be one of the top leaders this year.
Yeah, speaking of Akira coming in to fill the void left by former players, I understand they themselves are believed to be a spin-off of Konti, right?
Yes, exactly. So the Konti ransomware operation was one of the most prominent ransomware groups of the past maybe 10 years or so. We did see that group really kind of splintering into various other operations, some of which are believed to be now reformed as the Akira ransomware group.
Right. Right. So yeah, obviously a group of experienced people who know what they're doing and are just forming a new collective. Right. So along with those common TTPs and things that they're using, I think one of your reports on Akira also mentioned that they were using some less common tactics, that could be used both to, to elevate their sort of prestige, but also that might be able to be sort of seen as flags to see who you're dealing with. Can you talk to a couple of those?
Yeah, exactly. So we identified two techniques that were quite honestly relatively unique to Akira relative to all the various dozens of other ransomware operations that we track. And again, I do think this really speaks to the breadth of TTPs that this group uses, because certainly they are using the well-known initial access vectors, vulnerability exploits, phishing, and credential access, but some kind of specific TTPs that are relatively unique to them. One of which is some of their exfiltration mechanisms. When they have gotten a hold of some victim data, this is one of those ransomware groups that likes to exfiltrate it and use that to further extort victims. It's known as double extortion. They post it on a leak site, essentially. They used a very specific method of exfiltration using what's known as file transfer protocol. But this is actually a technique that's relatively not commonly used by other ransomware groups. It's not completely unheard of, but it's relatively specific to them. I think there's potentially reasons why they're using this, because maybe it's not being looked at as much. But as you mentioned, that can sometimes be a signal to defenders if they do see this activity popping up in their logs. They suspect they've been affected by ransomware. That could actually be an indication that it could be Akira. And the implication of that is raise the priority level of that investigation and response, because we're dealing with a pretty notable threat here.
Right. Was FTP the only real big notable thing they're doing that's unique to them, or anything else?
Yeah, there is actually one other technique. It relates to their persistence mechanisms. Akira has been observed actually creating their own domain level accounts on victim networks. And what that essentially means is they are giving themselves permissions to have wide access across the network. That is something that we see other adversaries using other means to achieve that. But when it comes to ransomware, that's not something that's extremely commonly done. It gives the operators the opportunity to come back to a network again and again, exfiltrate more data, and just kind of raise the level of the impact of any specific attack.
It's kind of surprising, right? Like neither FTP nor, creating your own domain level access. You wouldn't think that would be that rare of a technique, right? That seems like two common things right up the top of my head when I think about, compromising systems and such. But really, it's not those. Neither of those methods are very common. Are there reasons why those things aren't leaned on very often?
I think it's just because so many other mechanisms are proving to be successful and routinely so for our other operations. A big thing that we see associated with Akira, but lots of other ransomware groups, is exfiltration to sites like cloud hosting storage sites. It's just maybe something that's a little bit easier to implement. And because it continues to be successful and some of this traffic tends to slip through, it can blend in with legitimate network traffic. There's sometimes no need to go and figure out how to operate an FTP server and exfiltrate this data. If you have easier ways to do it, why not achieve that? But again, speaking to just continue evolution and finding many, many different ways to achieve impact, this is kind of a hallmark of this group for sure.
Right. So now, I guess going beyond Akira and considering the fact that they're using some pretty old vulnerabilities to get initial access into networks, right? It's always one of those things that I'm kind of harping on when I write about cybersecurity, right? I'm always like, hey, look, another 4-year-old, 5-year-old vulnerability that's being actively exploited. Come on, let's patch these systems here, right? Let's not leave these people a lot of room to wiggle. I mean, when you look at trends in these ransomware groups, right, are they going for a lot of cutting edge 0-day vulnerabilities, or are these groups actually more often than not seeking these soft targets who might not have patched things for 5, 6, 10 years, right? Who's at risk? Who's the big ones that are at risk right now?
Yeah, so like with many aspects of the modern threat landscape, it is a mixture of both. We see continued going back to the well and exploiting well-known vulnerabilities, as well as those continued attempts to find 0-day and net new vulnerability and exploits around them. On the targeting side, it is unfortunately truly a little bit of anyone and everyone these days. Certainly, the smaller targets who may have weaker defenses are low-hanging fruit for these adversary groups. But absolutely, that does not mean that major targets, major enterprises and organizations are not impacted and targeted by these groups as well. There is a very interesting dynamic, and it's definitely not just hype, where adversaries may go after the low-hanging, vulnerable fruit and kind of ancillary organizations, and then use that access to pivot in if they are suppliers or third parties of larger organizations, pivot into those primary target environments, and then capitalize at that point.
Right. So basically, it doesn't matter who you are, what size you are, right? You're at risk, especially if you're a small company like who doesn't consider themselves to be a target, but somewhere down the supply chain, right, does business with a major contractor. You're at an enhanced level of risk there too. So that's not great news for anyone, really.
Yeah, exactly. And these attacks can be very difficult to detect, but at the exact same time, some of those kind of core, quote unquote, cyber hygiene mitigations can have a dramatic impact on reducing your risk against these attacks. So it may not be feasible to implement advanced detection capabilities if you're a mom and pop shop, but you can look at implementing strong password policies and multi-factor authentication, asset inventory and patching. Those things do have a dramatic positive effect.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, you might not be able to do everything, but you can definitely do something to protect yourself from groups like Akira and others.
Yes.
Scott, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this with me today.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Brandon. Great chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we hear anything about the latest 0 days or old vulnerabilities being exploited, you'll be sure to hear about it on the Register.